project with this thing. Don't need to, but, all right. So, Scott Jungblom with the Oreille PUD, part of our license, our new license. It's not so new anymore, but the new license required us to put together an aquatic plant management plan, and part of that was an outreach program to try to get information to waterfront landowners in the county, primarily on the river, because that's in our license directive, all things dealing with the river. And the primary goals were established this program to try to get landowners in touch with tools available that they can use to manage their own aquatic vegetation programs, and then educate folks on the benefits of having native vegetation both on your riparian zone or your banks and under the water. Try to define the scope of what you are and aren't allowed to do on your shoreline. Try to hook you up with the folks that you need to know what you're allowed to do, permitting wise, that sort of thing. All that being said, because we also operate several water systems that pull water directly from the river and use in several communities, we try to focus on non-herbicide applications. A couple of reasons. One, just to reduce the amount of chemicals that are getting dumped in the water every year, and then also the river historically it's just been a really hard place to treat. Most of its locations do the flow. So flow, time of year, treatment window, a lot of different reasons make it hard to do with herbicides. So other folks have talked about those products and how you might be able to use it. Advances being made, but mine's going to focus on all the other things that you can do on your shoreline. So if I can figure out the buttons. Cool. You'd think there'd be 4 buttons long before it was working. It's like your keyboard's locked out.
Yeah. You might just have to.
There
It's
it goes.
working.
Yeah.
All right.
See if we can. Just be careful. Right there. Yeah.
Perfect.
Leave it.
Okay. So, one of the things that I figured out when they handed me this project about 15 years ago now was there's a predisposition for everybody that lives on the river, especially if they were around here in the 80s when it first came to be, to call everything that's in the water milfoil. I grew up here and I called everything that was in the water milfoil until I got this job and realized that no, milfoil is only about 10% of what we see out there on any given year. Sometimes it's as high as 30, but time after time people would call me in and say, hey, how do I get rid of this milfoil that's on my place? And I'd go up and ask them where, you don't have any milfoil. All this stuff is native vegetation. So I like to go over plant identification. I went out on the river last night and pulled some weeds so we can talk about the different kinds, try to show you the native vegetation, the things that they're good for, and identify so you can tell how to identify your own weeds, which ones are non-native that you want to get rid of if at all possible. So I'm going to go over that. I'm going to go over the benefits of the plants we talked about. And then I've got several different tools that I want to show you, but I've got a couple slides for the online folks just to talk about the different types of tools that I've run across over the past several years. Like the boat, all good things for aquatic weeds come from Wisconsin. When I first looked to try to give demo tools out here, you couldn't find any in the state, even if you were ordering it online. So I started just one tool a year. I'd go online and go to Wisconsin and order something just because I felt that people were hesitant to go out and purchase things. If you can't get your hands on it, you can't tell if it's decent. The only thing that was available anywhere in the 3 local counties closest to us was a beach rake, which, it's a good starter tool, but it's not representative of all the different tools that are out there. So we'll go over those as well. All right. Seaweed, milfoil, and other green slimy stuff. So native versus exotic or noxious aquatic vegetation is the thing I want to hit on next. So we've got 4 major bad weeds in and along our reservoir that I deal with on regulation. We have another one that we'll touch base on, but I don't have to deal with it very much, so I always forget to include it in my presentation. So the big one, the first one we've dealt with as a county was Eurasian water milfoil. Started showing up strong in the mid to late 80s, I think. And then we've also had curly leaf pondweed, probably about over the same time range. And I've got samples of both of those out there that I'll show you. Those both are obligate in-water plants. They don't grow up on the bank at all. Then we've got 2 relatively new ones compared to the first 2, flowering rush, which is our big bad weed right now that we're putting all of our emphasis on trying to keep under control so it doesn't destroy things, and yellow flag iris. Both of those can grow, well, slightly in the water, completely in the water, or up on a bank. So this is some pictures of Eurasian water milfoil. We have a native version of milfoil out there that I believe was discussed on the very first presentation, but they're really hard to differentiate and most people don't care, and I don't either, because we've got hybrids of the 2, and that's even harder to figure out. So if it looks like milfoil, I call it milfoil and we rip it out. But a lot of the times you'll see this bright red stem. That's a pretty good indicator that it's Eurasian water milfoil. They've got a very flimsy, delicate, feather-like leaf structure on them, which you can see in, I do have a laser pointer that works on it. In this picture, leaflets coming off of a central stalk, but they're a robust plant, but the leaves themselves are very delicate. Most of the time in an advanced or an older plant, the roots will be black. These are white, but this is, obviously a newly separated chunk of milfoil that's sending off new roots to try to re-root itself. One of the things that makes this plant such a pain to control is any fragment over about ½ an inch will, you break it off, you let it drift out, eventually it'll find some substrate somewhere and it'll send out a root and start growing. So fragmentation is really important to control when you've got an actual milfoil population that you're trying to deal with. Oh, there it is. All right. So getting back to that, hey, I've got a bunch of milfoil problem. This is a photo, I don't even know, it seems a little blurry, but I went out to a site and it was almost 100% not milfoil. Milfoil, this was the most concentrated shot I could take of the property. Everything else was Elodea inside. But when you're looking down through the water, trying to figure out where your plants are and how much you got of what, I considered this about a 10% milfoil population, and most of it was actually a native plant called Elodea that's almost everywhere in our river. Moving on. So that's about 50% milfoil population. You can see a bunch of native Pondweed over here, which a lot of folks call eelgrass. And milfoil, as it grows, I heard somebody talking about the canopy. So you'll have a single milfoil plant come up through a bed of native vegetation like Pondweed or Elodea, and when it gets above the plants around it, it will open up like an umbrella, and you'll have one stem sometimes covering 10 square feet of water. So while it may be a small percentage, it may be pretty impactful once it hits the top and canopies out. And that's 100%. So we do find that in a couple places. This actually came from Ashenfelter Bay up by Newport several years ago now. It was a band about 100 feet thick that was just nothing but milfoil all the way around. And oddly enough, we came back the next year, there was hardly any milfoil at all in it. So just because you have a root base there doesn't mean it'll be the dominant plant next year. Most of the time it does, but not always. So I'd like to cover some of the lookalikes that we have in here, native versus non-native. So here's just the picture of the same picture of Eurasian water milfoil. It's got several plants, native plants that look very similar to it out there, but they usually don't dominate the canopy like milfoil does. My favorite is coontail. I can't remember what its real name is, but coontail, yeah. But it's a really cool plant for a number of reasons. It is a very fibrous plant, so it's almost like a Brillo pad when you get a big handful of it. But what makes it unique is that in the fall, almost all of our other aquatic vegetation will die and fall back, and you'll get colonies of coontail that stay up in the water column, and they provide great habitat for the young of the year fish because everything else is laid down and it's still up, holding its three-dimensional shape, and they can, avoid predation through it. So makes a nice plant that way. Also, all the other veg tends to turn brown and get covered with paraphyton later in the season and start to rot, and coontail will still be bright and green and look pretty good. So I like it. It's one of my favorite aquatic plants that we have out there.
That's because you had a Davy Crockett hat when you were a kid.
I may still have it. All right, another one that's commonly confused with milfoil because when it grows it covers everything is Elodea. It's my favorite plant if you're doing work in there and you want to try to reseed some of your so say you had a bad milfoil infestation, you ripped it all out, and now you've got bare muck down there. You can actually go to other parts in the river, grab handfuls of this and stuff it into your muck or your shoreline, and start an Elodea batch, if you will. And it doesn't usually grow as high into the water column, and so when it gets thick, it'll look like green shag carpeting, just rolls over whatever substrate you have. And it keeps, like a good lawn, keeps the other weeds from coming in and reinfesting as quickly. So, really good native plant. And going here, water buttercup. So, we had, as part of our aquatic plant management plan, we have to do index surveys where we go up and down the river and look at the same spots every year, figure out, well, what percentage of this location is native, not native. And we have really high milfoil numbers for the first several years because I didn't know my plant ID good enough, and I was calling all of our water buttercup milfoil bad. We won't let anybody know that read those reports, but before it blooms, and see the blossoms down here, it's got a nice pretty white flower with yellow middle, and but before it blooms, when it's laying out in the water or even out on a table, and I'll show you out here, it's got a single central stalk like milfoil does with leaflets coming off of it. So it looks very milfoil-like until you get it up and really look at it. But the difference is that the leaves coming off of buttercup are in tufts, like pom-poms, if you will, and not individual leaves with those feathers, and it doesn't look like a feather, it looks like a clump. So if you were wondering, you get it out, take a look. If it's clump-like, then you've got buttercup before it blooms, and if it's feather-like, then you've got milfoil. Also, the water buttercup almost always has white roots. I don't have a picture of them up here. Maybe I do. White roots instead of black if you're ripping it up. And milfoil flowers are salmon colored red. So if you have a big bunch of red blossoms out there, then you know you got a milfoil population. That's about on that one. So our next bad weed, curly leaf pondweed. Last year, if you were at last year's song and dance, I couldn't find a single one. It was really discouraging because I like to show people these Turions because they're the easiest way if you come here later in the year to know whether or not you had a bad infestation. Somebody already covered early in the presentation that this is it's like winter wheat. It germinates in the fall, grows under the ice, so it's the first one that's a nuisance in the spring. Our runoffs, because it comes from so far up in Montana, is usually late enough that curly leaf does its thing and dies back before a lot of folks really are out using our river. But This year it's a problem, and you'll see it almost everywhere you go. I was looking for weeds yesterday and it came up in almost every bench that I pulled. So what makes it unique from all of our other pondweed, which we have about 25 different species of native pondweed out in the river, is that it has a really curly, crinkled outer margin on each of its leaves. And if you look close enough, I don't know, no, I didn't get a picture of it. It's got a little serrated teeth on the outer edge of each leaf, which you have several other Potamogetans that have a crinkly leaf on them, but none of them are crispy like this, and they don't have those teeth on the outer edge, outer margin of each leaf. And none of them produce this. This is the seed body, it's actually the stem of each major stem that comes up. It has leaves on it initially, but they fall off, and you're left with it looks like, it feels like the inside of the pine cone after a squirrel gets done with it. And they have little spikes on them as well. They're really painful when you walk on the beach with your bare feet, if you have wimpy feet like me. And that's how you know you have a bad infestation, or your upstream neighbor does. It's because you'll be walking along the shoreline and they'll just roll up in the little waves. There'll be a whole line of these things down there. So that's the Turion, and I have some out here that I can show you because we've got a lot out there this year. So here's some of the lookalikes to the curly leaf pondweed. This is native Potamogeton, and here's your, no, that's not curly leaf. This is another native Potamogeton, I believe. So you can see they look a lot alike, but the texture is what tells you that they're not. Curly leaf is a very firm leaf plant, and it's rough to the feel because of those serrations on the outside margin of the leaf, where these are a lot more supple leaves and a little bit larger, but they'll have the same wavy look to them. A lot of other pondweeds out there. Normally it's what fills my bin for my little show and tell, but due to the high water in the river still, I couldn't get a hold of hardly any of our other native Potamogetans. I don't know, they've all got great names like longleaf Potamogeton, everybody calls it eelgrass, narrowleaf Potamogeton, and broadleaf Potamogeton. So I just call them all Potamogeton, but they do look totally different. A lot of times folks will think that they have a bad milfoil problem before this plant leafs out at the top, because it's got a long, slender stalk. Sometimes they'll be growing in water over 20 feet deep, and they'll be thick. Right along, Greg's edition actually has, you'll have a band of milfoil about 30 feet offshore, and then you'll have a pretty wide band of this that grows up after it. But this is a native vegetation, and it, as far as I can tell, it just competes with milfoil, so it's beneficial. On the flowering rush, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because I know that Sharon's going to hit it a little bit later, but this is our newest baddie. Very pretty plant, that's probably why it's in here in the first place, but a lot of negatives. I can't remember if I touched base with it, but I'll just hit on briefly now. I call it a terraforming plant. So as you get heavy infestations of flowering rush and yellow flag iris, they're both a tuber rhizome-based plant, and they produce potato-like structures under the ground. They're so thick that they will actually fill in shallow bodies of water. So hence the terraforming. So you want to try to hit those two infestations as soon as you can. Also, because our river goes up and down, unlike most of the lakes around here, at a lot higher level, they become buoyant if they're thick enough. They produce gases underneath those mats of tubers, and you'll actually have some rip huge chunks of your bank out if you let it get too heavy of infestation. And they'll float down the river as a mat and then land somewhere else and start a new batch. So if you have flowering rush or yellow flag iris, you want to get it treated or removed as soon as you can. So it's got a really pretty composite head on it, pink flowers. This one is unique because it can grow 20 foot above the normal high water mark in what you would think would be dry grass, because our water fluctuates so much in the river. and it can also grow 20 feet under the water and never hit the surface. So it's a really hard plant to get a handle on. Its primary characteristics are it's got a triangle shaped cross section of the leaf, which is really cool. Easy, makes it easy to identify. Here are its rhizomatous tubers, if you want to call them. That's probably a better name for it. But what makes this plant, another thing makes it hard to control is each of these little root hairs are viable, and when they break off as you're pulling them, if you don't contain your root hairs, they'll just go plant themselves somewhere else. They also make little buds in the bottom that pop off and do the same thing. And up at the flower head, they've got another bud-like structure up there, budules or something like that, that can pop off and drift down the water and reseed. So, it's another shot of its rhizome. The rhizomes themselves can break off and reseed. I don't have any of these to show you out there, that's why I'm glad there's so many pictures in here, but we did get some yellow flag iris, and I'll show you what the tubers of those things look like. So we talked about this. It can grow up the bank and into the water. It doesn't really have very many lookalikes out there. We have rush plants out there, but they don't look anything like flowering rush to me anyways. Bulrush actually looks a little bit like it, but you can have a flowering rush growing right out in the middle of a bulrush and you can clearly see that it's different. This is duck potato, and when it's really young, just sprouting, its cross-sectional profile is actually U-shaped, but when it first comes out, it's kind of hard to differentiate between the two. So, and it's a native plant. So you might just, if you're in doubt, ask somebody or just wait for it to be a little larger before you have it removed. All right, there's yellow flag iris, another really pretty plant, another terraforming plant, as I talked about with the flowering rush, and it will fill a bay in a very short amount of time. We're talking less than a decade sometimes if your water conditions and the water depths are just perfect for it. It produces a nice pretty yellow flower. I've got one of those out there. It's not quite as pretty as these because I had to transport it in the back of my truck, so it's a little wind whipped. But it produces a really unique seed pod, and these are viable seeds that pop out. You can see this is a shovel full of the root base where you've got the potato-like, sweet potato-like tubers that grow through there. Those are what produce the gas and become wind. And they're very heavy. The first time I did one of these workshops and went out and got some, I thought, well, I'll just get like about a square foot. And it was more than I could pick up to put in the boat, so I put it back down, cut it in half and put it in there. There's a lot of shore, a lot of your bank that it rips off when it decides it wants to float away. And the seed pods, when you open them up, almost look like corn kernels on the inside. Don't eat them. I had a guy that played that joke on me. Oh, people eat these all the time now. All right, so just for reference, I like to show this. This is not a comprehensive list of all the native or aquatic plants we have in our system, but these are the most common ones. We developed this list about 15 years ago now when we were doing our license. And it just shows you how many native aquatic plants we have out there. The native and for the most part beneficial aquatic plants. The ones highlighted in blue there, those are only noxious weeds that we have to deal with. So even though you might get a heavy infestation of one of these plants, there's a lot of good ones out there. So I won't spend much more time on that one. Let's see if I missed anything here. Oh, on regular, on those index site surveys, over the past 10 years, we've only had about 10% of all of those sites, not the sites in general, but all together. If you combine all 20 sites we've investigated here, only about 10% of them are dominated by non-native vegetation all together. So we're really doing pretty good as far as the weeds in the Pondweed River. All right, so real briefly, we're going to talk about benefits of maintaining healthy aquatic plant population. So a lot of folks on the river have erosion problems, and a lot of times it stems from the fact that either through development of the property or previous landowners, they've taken the vegetation off of the riparian zone, the bank and or the top of the piece of property, and didn't leave a vegetated buffer zone in there. And that's pretty easy to see when you get rainwaters and river water comes up. You don't have the vegetation lock in that soil in there, it just gets wiped away, and then you've got a cut bank that you have to deal with through the years that you have to suffer through it, because they're really hard to deal with once you allow them to happen. Same kind of thing happens if you rip up all your aquatic veg. So folks that have a pretty long stretch of shoreline, I like to encourage them to leave as much native vegetation on the areas of their bank that they're not using on a regular basis. You know, everyone likes to have a cleared spot, but if you can leave a healthy crop of whatever you've got, even if it's milfoil sometimes, that aquatic vegetation really buffers against wave action, especially if you have boats coming by all the time, because it will reduce a major wake coming in by 90% sometimes if you've got the right plant composition in there, just like a wave sponge. So that's one benefit for having a nice native population of aquatic veg in front of your place. Another presenter, or a couple now, have talked about nutrients. So if you want to prevent your algae blooms, you want native aquatic vegetation, because they're using the same resources as algae does. So the more systemic aquatic veg you have, the less resources that'll be there for massive algae bloom. And then, like having a healthy lawn, if you've got native vegetation out there, then it's just that much harder for the noxious weeds to come in and seed your lot. So anytime you can do that, it's a benefit. And lastly, juvenile fish rearing in overwinter habitat. So that's with the predation with cormorants and bass, pike minnow in the river. The young of your fish really use that vegetation for avoidance when they're talking about hunting. Hiding hunt predators. So that's where the coontail really comes in. And in the summer, if you float over a bed full of Elodea, it's waving in there, you can see just thousands and thousands of little fish swimming up through it. So that's where our primary production happens. All right, so before I move on, anybody have any questions about the vegetation? We'll go out and look at plants, I think right when we're done, and the tools, but before I move on, I'd see if, yeah.
On the flowering rush, if we see that on our property, what should we do? Because it sounds like if we try to pull it out, we're gonna spread it all over the place.
I'm gonna defer.
So we have two contractors hired. One to dive, and you'll be receiving a letter shortly about this. One to dive and pull the plants that are in the water, and then one to come along and spray the ones on the shoreline. Now, if you don't want your spray, then the diver will address those also on the shoreline.
But we shouldn't do anything ourselves.
I would prefer if you don't, and you know, I can't say you can't, but the diver has had, you know, lots of training to do it to make sure he gets everything.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm glad you asked that. I didn't spend much time on this, but this is what a completely submerged flowering rush looks like. I mean, the ones that are coming up into the air are obvious. They look like a pretty rush or flowering plant. But when they're completely submerged, the leaves are a lot more flaccid. They just lay in the current and they wave. They aren't stiff like the ones that are actually breaking the surface. So, and they're usually a more brownish red in tone. You can see, you know, like right in there, where the ones that emerge are a lot brighter green. So, anybody else? All right. Oh, Gotta get just right.
Yep.
All right, so, moving on to tools. So, yeah, I've touched on it before, but when I first started looking to try to give folks information on this, it just wasn't anything. So primarily, I wanted to get the tools in hand that were readily available, test them out. We've got a ponded box, and we've got a bunch of different boat launches that we played with them at. Invariably, every time I get a new tool, whoever's at the district that has a shoreline, they say, hey, I need to borrow that for a while and just test it out, see what works. So I got some pretty good user information on some of them. But I get a lot of my information just by, cruising the internet, because that was the only source available at the time. And not that I'm promoting that anybody buy products from this, but as far as just information goes, weedersdigest.com, funny name, that's where I've got 90% of my tools and information from, because every time he gets a new tool in that he's trying to sell to folks, he goes out and uses it, makes a nice user video, and puts it on there. So he's got just about everything. I did find some new tools this year that I have some pictures of that he doesn't sell yet. So there's other places to look. But I want to go through them. I just kind of threw them into categories just so I can talk about benefits and drawbacks of each one, and combinations that I think are good. So if you're, in general, if you're doing your own work, then you got to figure out what I want to do. Do I want to do pushing? Do I like to do pulling? Do I want to do it myself? Do I want a power tool to help me do it? There's lots of different options that are available. And do I want to have something that's completely hands-off? So I want to go through the different categories and the combos that I thought were most beneficial. So under hand tools, in general, you've got cutters and pullers. And then within cutters and pullers, you've got things that you throw out there and have to drag back. And then you've got tools with the really long handles. So you either kind of toss them out and pull them back, or you push them sometimes out, like sweeping your carport. All of them have, are effective in different ways. Some, in my opinion, handle the current of the river better. Some do not. But there's a lot of variability out there, and you just gotta either try some or figure out, put some thought into how you want to do your work first before you go out and buy something. Then you got rakes. So I think I've got more slides, so I'm not going to get into that. Rollers. Some of the rollers have tiller type heads on them. Some have cutter type heads, and some have combinations. Then you've got rototillers, more or less. They're just hand pulled tilling devices. They do a better job of getting deeper. You move more sediment around, mobilize sediment, so that it doesn't hang out on your shoreline as much. And then there's combinations that I'm going to go through. So then we've got power tools. Under power tools, there's cutters, rollers, and rakes. I've got some pictures of each of those, and we'll talk about them in more detail. And then we've got contracted services. In there, primarily, you've got ground barriers, custom pulling and diving, and now harvesting. So there's options, a lot of different options out there. So we'll start going through them. This is just a picture of major categories. So you got several different kinds of rakes, homemade ones, standard. This was the first tool I found, the only one in the county at the time, just a beach rake. You've got big tooth rakes and Godzilla rakes, so there's both versions of those out there. Here's a picture of a tiller, which you can see out here. This is a unique tool, a T-weeder. It was what I was using to collect my samples yesterday. Got caught on something, so I don't have it to show you today. After I'm done here, I gotta go get a boat and pull it out. And then this is a new tool that's developed locally, fairly new. It's been here for 3 or 4 years now, I think. It's called Weed Ray. It's really unique. I'll talk about that more out there. And then blades. Here's a serrated blade that pushes or pulls, but it's on a long handle. It's not a throwable. And then you got several different kinds of throwables. Most of them have very sharp V-shaped blades. You eat them out there and jerk them back. And then you've got rollers. So this is a weed roller that's got serrated blades, pulling blades, and cutting blades. So rakes, won't spend much more time on that. The reason I put them in there 3 or 4 different times is you pretty much always have to have a rake to go with whatever you're using. If you're tilling, you're gonna break off fragments. If you're cutting, you're gonna have big mats that you need to reel in. So you need to find a rake you wanna use, preferably something you can attach floats to, so you toss it out there, it floats near the top of the water, and you can drag that floating vegetation in with you. A lot of them are designed to be able to float and or sink, so after you're done cutting, if you've got really loose muck down there, you can toss your rake out, that'll sink, the teeth will sink in, and you can start working on your root base after you've got the top cut off. So sometimes it's a 2-step program. You don't have to do that, but if you want it to last longer, you gotta get the roots out. This was a new find for last year, Rakezilla. It's basically the big lake rake, but double-sided. What's worse than throwing something out there and having to haul back weeds, throwing it out there and having it upside down and having accomplished nothing. So that keeps you from doing that thing. I love this rake. I haven't got one yet, but I'm gonna get one. And as you can see from this, you can do it on both, but these are just styrofoam floats. You can get the pipe insulation, you can get the kids' pool noodles, and just tape them on the shank. And we've got ours, zip tied to the back of this, and I don't ever put them on the 2 sides. I think that might float you too high, but I've never tried it. Maybe it'd be better. This also has holes in the bottom of the tines and a big heavy piece of like 200-pound test monofilament running through there to keep, if you've got a heavy mat that you just cut and you want to bring back in, it keeps it from flipping out of the bottom of those tines. So pretty useful tools. These are the most useful that I've seen if you're doing just straight water work. They also have super long tines. Like I was saying, if you have the muck, you fill this shaft with gravel, lead shot, however heavy you want to throw it out there, and then it'll force it down in the muck, and you can rip your roots out easier. All right, which one is it? Tillers and pullers. So we've got examples of both these out here. This is a weed roller. It's got a really long shank on it, and it's basically just electrical conduit. So if you want a little bit more reach, you just buy the tool and you add your own handles on it with just a set screw in it at each section. But they're really handy if you get out there early and you do, weekly weed control. If you've got heavy infestations, you're gonna have to cut it down, knock it down with a razor or cutter of some kind before this will have much effect. Otherwise, you're just gonna be out there mashing it to death. The other handy tool about both the rollers and the tillers is that they address the muck problem. So if you're in a depositional area, the more you use that, the less muck you'll have. And the less muck you have, the less likely you're gonna grow the next weed fragment that comes by. It's gonna roll on past you. So good tools, but good tools to have in combination with some kind of a cutter. This is just called the lake tiller. Pretty simple. I think these are just concrete anchors, but in a set of the PVC pipe. End caps, little bearings on each end. This was originally designed as a hand pulling tool for folks that had really shallow, long gradient under their shoreline. So you take it out of the water, set it in there, and just take a rope and pull it behind you. That works really well if you've kept up on your stuff, but if every spring when you get there, you've already got 4 foot of vegetation. I took this out at my old boss's house on a boat, dropped it in the water about 15, 20 feet off the shore. By the time we got it halfway in, we had to hook it up to his tractor to pull it out. And when it came out, it was about the size of both those tables put together. And you couldn't see any part of the tiller. That's how much veg had rolled up on it, and we yarded it up on shore. So really effective if you got a heavy infestation, but don't try to do it by hand. They come in, this is a 4-footer, I think. Well, look, we'll get out there, but I think they come in 2 foot, 4 foot, and 8 foot sections. I don't know what kind of hydraulics you need to pull an 8-footer through anywhere, but it's definitely at that point not a hand tool. And again, this, you can open those caps, and if you want a little bit more weight for some more penetration to get the roots, you just put some gravel in there. I filled mine up the first time. Don't do that. Way too much. You want to put third in there maybe. It was really heavy to get back on the boat. Oh, I moved it.
Oh, no.
Watch it shut off and everybody online will get disconnected. Where did they go? It did. Maybe my buttons will work now. Just try. I broke it.
You did. Oh, here, right there.
What's getting under now?
Yep, it went, that thing moved.
Okay, this is
Hey,
working.
it's working now.
All right, where was it? It was there. No, going backwards. All right, the tea weeder. This tool's been around a long time, but they recently changed its look. Now it is a true T. It used to be kind of a downstream V, but it works as a puller more than a cutter, which is really kind of nice if you want to get at those roots, especially if you have a lot of muck, because the veg pulls more readily out of muck than if you've got a higher gravel concentration. But so simple. Again, double-sided, so you can't throw it wrong. Love that. These big, heavy, serrated teeth are offset. It's a double layer, so that's how they grab the stems. So you've got long-grown plants, heavy stems, very effective tool. I wish I had mine to show you, but it's, like I said, out here right now. But as far as pullers go, highly recommend it. So our other big puller, this is the Weed Ray. It's adjustable. In general, how it works is it's a long pole instead of a throwable, like the tea weeder, which for the river, I like that because I don't throw well. So it always goes to the same spot or it never goes where I want it, especially if I have that one patch left. You know, you get up to it and it'll push off the patch you want. The advantage to having positive control long handle devices is that you can direct them and the current doesn't mess you up as much. So this is designed like a manta ray. Those are saw blades, but if you tilt the angle of them right, so it's slightly down away from you as you push it out, it floats over the vegetation as you're pushing it out. If you push it out fast enough, you let it sink and you pull it back, and the teeth of the saw blades are pointed back toward you, and that's what cuts and tears and pulls the roots up. It's both a cutter and a puller, depends on how fast you pull it back. It's got a really long wingspan, so if you want less, then you tilt those blades in toward you more so that they aren't grabbing as much water, if you just don't want to have to pull as much back each time. The other thing is, the angle of attack is adjustable. So you have a steep bank, you want that more shallow. If you have a shallow bank, you want it steeper so that it either does dig in or it doesn't dig in. Preferably you want it, skimming back across when you're bringing it back so it's not tucking into the ground. But all your angles are adjustable on that. So it's really, really a useful tool. I've used it quite a bit and like it. Cutters. I'm not a big fan of cutters because they don't get at the roots, and I like to do it less often because I'm lazy. So, what's that?
I said you're cutting them and then they're flowing away.
Well, yeah, but all these things, you're cutting them and they're floating away at some point. You get more of them back on like a tiller. But almost everything, you got enough fragmentation or big chunks that fall off that's why you have your rake with you. I wouldn't say that you get any more or less fragmentation with cutters. They're just bigger fragments, where all of your other projects or tools end up breaking smaller fragments off that are harder to collect. So there's pluses and minuses for that both ways. But I'm glad you reminded me of that. So as part of our
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
If you have one plant that is growing, you've got one plant, but if you cut it or if you pull it out and break all these fragments, you could end up with 100 plants.
Yeah, so just getting to that. So as part of licensing our two big machines that we have on the river to do public boat launches, we had to do studies on fragmentation. And one is a rotor tiller based machine, and one is a harvester that just cuts like a lawnmower. It just goes along and with sickle bars on the water, cuts it, brings most of the vegetation up on the boat to haul away on a big conveyor belt. So, but both of them have big paddle wheels, and they're chopping up the plants too. So we had to do a fragmentation study on both of those machines, first one then the other, to determine what the fragmentation rate was, and is it a net gain or is it a net loss? So what we did is we set up a control site where we did, all of our treatments were on 100 foot of shoreline. So we set up big seine nets, small mesh seine nets to collect all the fragmentation drifting down the river, both in front of and below heavy stretch of shoreline, so heavily vegetated stretch of shoreline. And so we set it up and we let it fish for 24 hours, and we collected the downstream net at the end of the 24 hours. The upstream was just to block what's coming down the river. So we were only capturing the veg that was released from that stretch of shoreline. So we do that for control, and then we reset the nets, and we come in with our machines and cut them up and do our normal treatment, take out as much veg as we could, and then we do our count after that to see what the fragmentation was after. So we had a control and for the same window. So and what we did to calibrate it is, since most of our bad plants are auto-fragmenting plants, which means that if they're healthy and growing, they're sending off fragments all the time, regardless of whether you're touching them. So what we wanted to say is, okay, is it better, even if we have an increased fragmentation for that short window while we're treating it, or is it better to just leave that healthy plant out there to fragment all year long? And we found it was about 100 times better to treat it, even if you're gonna dump fragments down there, than it is to leave all that biomass, because now instead of a little plant that you're chopping every week and you get little fragments going out there, you've got this huge plant that it's sending off fragments 24/7 at that point.
Is
So.
Milfoil one of those that sends out fragments all the time?
Oh yeah, that's the primary one, right? Yeah.
I understand, thank you.
Yep. So even if you don't get them all, you're better off cutting it. Yeah.
We're getting low on time.
Low on time. Cruise through. Okay, thank you. I like to talk. All right. So power tools. You've got those three: cutters, rollers, and power rakes.
Do you have any pictures of those?
Yep, coming up. So here's a boat-mounted harvester, I like to call it. It's just got a sickle bar on the bottom. You hook it to your boat. The one I used is better in the front of the boat. For whatever reason, you can also hook it off to the side, but the control was just better in the front. There's a couple different versions of this, so do some shopping. This is one of the tools I wouldn't recommend going to Weeder's Digest for, because it doesn't have an extension to get you deeper in the water. And the other one, don't know where I got it, it did have an extra 4-foot extension, which in our river is really useful to have. So they're fast and effective. You gotta have something to get your fragments back in, because you can really mow through a lot of veg with this one. It's fairly expensive. I think he paid $1,500 for his, something like that. But it also requires a boat. He put his on a little 12-foot boat with a 5-foot kicker, so it doesn't take much of a boat. Lake, groomer, and weed rollers. So these are long, like irrigation pivots basically, but they're just set on a hydraulic pump motor at the center of the pivot, and they just roll back and forth in whatever arc you set up for them, and they just kind of crush the veg down. We have some, well actually I don't know if we sold a weed roller out here yet. I think we have some weed rakes that are automated, but the key is getting them in early. So you want to treat early in the year before you have a bunch of veg. They have a hard time plowing through. Or if you waited too long, you're going to have to do an initial cut to let them have access to your shoreline. Same thing with the power rakes, which I'm going to touch on next. So this is how a power rake works. The same thing, kind of a central pivot, but this particular one you can set anywhere you want and goes the full circle around. We have one of these in action in the north end of the county, and when I asked them after the second year, they said, yeah, it worked really good one year because the plant growth or the river went down early. You could get it out there early. It was pretty effective. The next year was like this. Water stayed high long. The plants were already up. and he said he just could never get it to really work. But the advantage of these guys is they never stop. So once you get down to bare dirt, you can move from spot to spot. But as long as you go back on a regular basis, then you're gonna clear out your muck, and you won't have anything reseeding. I think, did I go the wrong way?
Yes.
This is like I said, next thing, cool new tools. So we don't have one of these yet. I really want to see one do it. Basically, you need a boat to use it, but you yard this sucker out into or out from your shoreline. You have something pulling back on the base here, and this rope is tied to this sled. The sled slides off the base, goes down in the water, and you have a winch or piece of equipment that drags it from the deep up to your shoreline, and it's gonna take all that veg with it and probably a lot of muck. So I'd really like to see somebody get one of these and try it on a river, because if you have the right shoreline, not too steep, I think it could be very effective. Other new tools, aqua thrusters. I first thought these were all for muck, which is a benefit, but they also, if you have the right shoreline, you could probably install one of these, and after you've cleaned it up, that would keep new veg from regrowing. I don't think it would have much of an effect on a really well-established veg population, but I know that we've had folks get these through our grant program recently, so hopefully we'll get some information on how well they work. And this is the one I found this year. This is like the weed roller that we have out there, but you can see the tines are not the little blades that we have on the other tool when you go out there and look, but they're meant to penetrate and really pull roots. So I'm guessing that this is either already heavy enough, so that you don't need to, depending on how it's built, or you can fill that with some gravel as well to get it really pushed down through there. But the weed roller is pretty effective as it is, so I think that this might be a weed roller on steroids. So I'm excited to see how well that works if somebody ends up getting one through the grant program. All right, and that's also not available through Weeder's Digest. That's the new guy I found this year, the Pond guy. So just a website. All right. Any questions on tools? Yeah.
Scott, I got a question with some of the plants and stuff. I pulled some from the river property on Wednesday and brought some. So can I bring those to you when we go out?
Yeah.
Help identify things?
Yeah. And I'm, like I said, I misidentify things all the time. I have to go back to the book, but there's a lot of experts here that can help me if I can't get them.
Great.
Okay, anyone else?
We've got one online here.
All right.
So can PUD collaborate with other agencies to put into effect some limitations like staying 200 feet from the shoreline to help reduce damage to water quality and fish habitat?
No, that's not within our purview. That's a good question.
All right. And, okay. And then I think if anybody here has questions in person, they can ask you when you go outside too.
I'll be here all day. So.
Okay, sounds
And
great.
at the very end, we have the ability to, I'm gonna throw all the tools in a truck. We're gonna go down to the boat launch right here. If anybody wants to try out one of the ones that I do have on hand, you're more than welcome to. So just let me know.